Sure. So psychological contracts are basically the unwritten perceptual contracts that arise in the course of a relationship. And if they are not communicated, then one party is left to develop their own interpretations from the expectations from the relationship. And that is what this whole domain of psych contracts evaluates. So our work actually looks at the role of psych contract breaches on buyer supplier relationship dissolution. So we are seeing how not trying to fulfill the psychological contracts can actually result in breaking away from an existing relationship. Sure. In order to study the impact on psychological contract breaches on relationship dissolution, we first utilized lab experiments and then we complemented our findings with insights from practitioners. So for the experiments, we had university students who were role playing as buyers in our organization, and they actually had a choice to develop relationship between two suppliers. And once they were in an existing relationship, we simulated a psychological contract breach via the non-delivery of a product. And then we examined whether they decided to stay with the supplier or change to a new supplier. The important thing here is that there was a switching cost involved. So whenever a buyer decided to switch suppliers, they were essentially losing some money. And because the students were incentivized based on their profits, it was actually eating into their incentives also. And once we had completed our experiments, we actually spoke with some practitioners and found that what we found in our study actually mirrored what was happening out in the real life also. So we studied the impact of three attributes of psychological contract breaches. They were attribution, severity, and timing. And we found that attribution and severity impacted the relationship dissolution. In other words, we found that reneging on a psychological contract actually resulted in buyers breaking away from relationships. But it was interesting because reneging actually resulted in an emotional response. So they got angry or sad, which actually resulted in this behavior of breaking away from a relationship. But we also found that severity, or how much damage this side contract breach had on their business, was also a main factor. But severity did not have a severe emotional response as attribution. So maybe it just reflects about how in the B2B world, people take into granted that there'll be some profits and losses. But the fact that somebody is deliberately trying to harm their organizational working elicits a severe emotional response, which can then result in breaking away from a relationship. So what we actually find that the key criterion to mitigate the consequences of psychological contract breach is communication. So whenever practitioners are talking with their, for example, a buyer is talking with their supplier or a supplier is talking to their buyer, they should talk about everything, even what is not included in the contract. So while the contract covers most of the technical requirements and stuff, they have to make sure, like they talk about stuff like how many times are we going to call? If some X happens, how can I get into contact with you? Would you like me to follow up if something happens or not? And these will actually mitigate any of the psychological contract breach attributes. So there will be less chances for reneging. Disruption is something that people have no control over. For example, if there is a port strike or there is bad weather. So I think practitioners know that this will happen and we have no control over that. But whenever it is possible to communicate that, hey, listen, this is what is going on, and so that's why I haven't been able to do what I promised, it will help the practitioners to maintain the relationships. So talking about the future of the research, I think some interesting our findings suggest that we should most likely look at the long-term impact of psychological contract breaches. So in our work, we just looked at a one-time breach and how the supplier or the buyer decided to exit from the relationship. But what does it mean for the long term? Does he ever get back to that supplier at all? Or does that mean an end to the relationship? Especially now that buyer or supplier has so many different alternatives of organizations that they can work with, it becomes really important to understand what the long-term impact is of psychological contract breaches. And another interesting finding that I found was this role of emotions and how emotions actually resulted in breaking away from the relationship. So, what should practitioners be careful about? How should they talk or communicate that they do not elicit these negative responses or emotions from their counterparts? That will actually help in maintaining safe and healthy relationships.